So I'm working with the Winsor & Newton watercolour pans, and this is my Da Vinci Pure Sable brush, and when I do a larger wash, I will use my Pettigrew Pearl mop brush. With watercolours, you don't need many brushes. I find a big mop brush and a beautiful detail brush, and perhaps a rigger for some work, is all you need. Anything else is just a bonus. Now, you probably need sketching skill more with watercolour than you do for oil paint. You can sketch before you paint, which is the normal for my watercolour style, or you can paint first and sketch the details in with the paint, which is my normal for oil painting and pastel work. So with the transparent medium, I tend to start with my sketch down very lightly on the paper before I begin. Because the work is transparent, it doesn't allow room for error. Whereas when you're working with an opaque medium that you can push around and construct with, I tend to do my painting with the paint later in the detail and the refinement stage. And I'll tend to go for massing in of light and shade and tones and colours initially and worry about the intricacy of the detail work last. So you still need those drawing skills, but you use them at different stages of the painting, depending on the medium that you're working with. The skills that you learn when you're painting with one medium will apply to the other. The only thing that will differ is the technique that you use for that particular work. And as I said, with watercolour, you're working with a transparent medium, and you need to let the water do a lot of the work. So you don't want to be in full control. You want to allow a little bit of excitement, a little bit of keeping it unknown how it's going to finish. You can start off with an idea in mind, but let the water be the boss. Don't try to dictate to it too much, or you just have a very tight amateurish work. And so you need a lot more confidence to do watercolour than perhaps doing the opaque mediums. With your opaque mediums, your oils and your pastels, your acrylics, you pretty well know how you can plan how that work is going to end up. And you can pretty well make it end up the way you plan. With the watercolour, allow for the water to do a lot of it, and just egg it along towards the general idea that you want, but allow for that beautiful transparency and the interaction of the pigments on the wet paper. Let it surprise you. Now I'm working on a 300-gram sheet of Fabriano Artistico paper. Now, I love my paintings. I had to think about this one because I need, with watercolour, to be a little bit more careful, being transparent. As I said, no room for error here. I really planned this work very carefully. And as I said, there's no correcting it as watercolour. But keep in mind, you don't have any wasted paper, so you might as well use quality, because if it doesn't work as watercolour, well, you can go and do that pastel work on top. I don't intend to. I intend to make this work as watercolour. In fact, I've got a spot on the wall just above my desk. This will look lovely if it turns out as I'm hoping. Now, there's a lot of white roses in the garden where this lady is sitting, and all I have done is put down a little bit of light colour of sunshine. I put down a little bit of the cadmium lemon yellow, and I put it where the lady's hair will be, her face, her arms and legs, where the sunlight will be on them. And I've put it a little bit where the white roses will go, and on the chair legs. I haven't decided yet what the chair legs will be. She's in a green plastic chair, and I'm not sure whether I'm going to paint them green or mock up a cane chair out of my imagination or reference photos at this stage, or just leave the chair legs subdued in shadow. So there's one tiny little bit of this painting that is not planned. I'm going to leave that to suggest itself later on. It's not going to be a focal point of the painting, the chair legs, so it's most likely I'll just leave them vague and out of focus and in shadow. But the roses in this rose garden are very much a major part of the painting. And so having glazed on a little bit of the lemon yellow, I'm now cutting in around all these roses. I'm not trying to draw or paint an individual rose. I'm just cutting in patches of sky, patches of foliage. There'll be some further back, so you've got the very pale cerulean and cobalt blues from the sky. Very, very atmospheric and hazy in the distance. And then you're coming in with the Viridian green, which is a beautiful transparent green. It's my favorite green for a watercolor. You can start with that beautiful jade green and then modify it. You can add a little bit of red to it to tone it back, a little bit of blue to it, a bit of yellow to it. So there's many ways you can vary that one green. So you don't need a lot of greens on your palette if you're a watercolorist. Perhaps one is more than enough for Australians, where we don't have a lot of green in our foliage. And perhaps if you're in Europe, Ireland, you might want 2 or 3 greens. But to give you the variety, the light over there is a different light, and the greens are quite vivid. But for Australians, this beautiful jade green, that will get you through doing seascapes, and it will also work in portraiture and flower painting, and just adding either, as I said, yellows, reds or blues to it to vary it to get the different tones. In this case, I'm going in with even more Viridian, just intensifying that very subtle jade wash background that suggested foliage behind the lady. I don't actually want a lot of bright green at all in this painting, but you can see how it fades away as your painting dries. That wash that you put down will always fade. Now I'll come back while my painting paper is still very slightly damp, not wet anymore, but very slightly damp, so that when I put down these little dancing around the brush, it's more than a doll, but you kind of dance this brush around to get very natural looking foliage clusters in there. And the edges of what I'm putting down is softening. The very slightly damp paper is working those edges and taking away any hard lines from them. I drew out these roses, and so I'm not actually painting the roses, I'm painting the negative space around the roses. And I'm cutting in, this could be a big rose clump and lots of little ones in behind it, and just by this cutting in, I'm starting to shape up this grouping of roses. I'm adding a little bit of cobalt blue into this because I feel that it's getting a little bit too green. A little accents of the cobalt blue here. And again, I'm allowing the slightly damp paper to interact with what I'm putting down and starting to move it around a little bit, because we don't want to have any hard-edged patches of blue here. So very much relying on the fact that my paper with the dampness in it will change what I'm putting down. And you have to hope that it's going to change it for the better and for the way that you want it to. But you don't know, and that's the excitement with watercolor. You need to free yourself from control. You have to have fun with watercolor. This is the second stage of my painting of colour in the rose garden. Now, I'm carrying on using the cobalt blue mixed with the Viridian green to create the effect of the foliage from the rose bushes, the climbing roses that are behind Carla, my model in the garden. I originally bathed many of the areas that would remain white with cadmium yellow light. It will just be enough to warm the paper, take the coldness off the paper, and give the feeling of light, sunlight. I'll need to mute some of these bright, clear colours eventually, but for the moment, I'm happy working with these lovely, bright colours. They will fade a little bit. I'm working with a pure sable brush, and I put down some of the wash with a mop brush. It points beautifully, so I can get up to a lovely fine lines with this brush. It's about a size 7. I'm not sure the exact size. It's not all that relevant. I use a big brush for big areas and a little brush for little areas. That's the general rule. There's no special brush you have to have. Your pure sable brushes or your pure pettigrew pearl, which is squirrel hair, any natural hair brush will carry more fluids, more wash, more water than any of the synthetics. Regardless of what the manufacturers try to tell you or the salespeople try to tell you about how wonderful the synthetic brushes are, none of them have yet been able to compete with the water holding capacity of the natural hairbrush. And for that reason, I'll continue to use my natural hair brushes. As I said, you don't need a lot of brushes in watercolour, and a good watercolour brush can last you a lifetime. I have a suggestion. Get an inexpensive engraver or borrow one and engrave your name and phone number or email address or something onto your brush. I've taken our students out on paint outs many times, and somebody will drop a brush in the grass, and those brushes can be worth over $100. If you take the trouble to put a bit of identification on them, there's every chance that you'll get it back. Also in classes, sometimes brushes can inadvertently get picked up by a neighbour if you're working alongside somebody on a table. If you've got your identification on that brush, it will help. Another thing that can help you if you're going off to mixed group classes and you're concerned about your brushes accidentally getting picked up by a neighbour, get a bottle of an unusual colour nail polish and put a little dob of bright purple or bright yellow, something unusual, on the end of your brush, something that clearly identifies that all your brushes are identified, colour-coded as being yours. That's a great deterrent for a brush accidentally ending up in somebody else's box. It's worth taking those precautions if you are going to be investing in very high quality brushes. I know a teacher, would you believe, who wasn't above trying to accidentally accumulate brushes. So, yeah, a little bit of, I always kept that engraver in my studio, and when I used to sell art supplies too, I'd be able to supply them to my students at a good price, and the class, it was convenient for them to be able to get their art supplies as they were learning to paint. But that was way back in the Buninyong Gallery days. We had the art supply shop, and the students would be able to access the engraver and identify everything clearly at the time that they bought it. It was a good trick. Nobody ever lost a brush. So as I said, get yourself a couple of quality brushes. They will last you. They'll be worthwhile. I bought my first expensive watercolour brushes when I was 11 years old, and I still have those brushes. What I'm doing here, you're probably more interested in what I'm doing. I picked up some cadmium red dark because these colours were rather bright. And I'm not actually trying to paint this down as a red, but I'm dipping it into areas where the Meridian green was still wet, or I've mixed it on the palette there with a little bit of Meridian green to sort of picked up the red and then tapped into the green without fully mixing it at the same time. And so these are little shaded off patches of the green foliage of the roses. Also perhaps some of those lovely red bronze foliage that you get with some of the roses. But I'm just varying the colour now in this rose foliage, and also the toning, because this is a darker tone than the others. So I'm continuing to work in the negative space area around the white roses. I'm not sure at this stage whether I'll need to actually paint or define any of these spaces as being a rose, or whether just having painted around them will be enough. As I said, let the watercolour create itself. You can actually plan things, but you don't have to fully plan. Now, that magic bit of watercolour equipment that just passed across was my cup of coffee. I have a little game I play with every painting. I do it with my oil painting. Anytime I'm starting to create an artwork, I will not allow myself to knock off for a cup of coffee until such time as I feel I have the block in, well underway and going well. Well underway and going well. Terrible writing. Two wells in the sentences. But you know what I mean. I'm happy. I know it's going to work. So I can at that point stop and have that cup of coffee and sip it as I work. I'm very confident now. Before you start a watercolour, often that confidence is something you've got to fake. You've got to bluff yourself to feel confident to tackle the subject. Watercolour is never easy. I have seen one of the world's greatest watercolourists stand up in front of a group of students to demonstrate a figure, and it was a nun, so it was very heavily costumed. There wasn't really much of the figure to show. It was more a cloak. Very little face to show because the face was in shadow, and he attempted to demonstrate this and it failed. And that's the thing. Even the greatest watercolourist knows that there is no guarantee, even with the most expensive brushes and best quality paints and expensive paper and all that skill and knowledge, that a watercolour is going to work. So when you start to work your watercolour, you've got to bluff it initially. You've got to take that confidence, believe, and not worry. Your worry will cripple you. You mustn't worry. As I said, if you were standing there in public, and I've done this, I've stood in front of a huge crowd and painted a portrait in public. And I did a little bit of pep talk and bluffing and kidding myself, that yes, you can paint a portrait in front of the public. You're not going to make a fool of yourself. You don't even think that negative thought. And as it happened, it turned out well. Chose a model that I was very confident to paint, and I thoroughly enjoyed myself and working in oils. Of course, I could continue to make structural changes. If I didn't have a full likeness at one point, or something was out of proportion, you can fix it, and the public aren't even aware that you're off the rails at any point because it's fully manipulatable. Whereas your watercolour, as I said, it's transparent, and something could change to the wrong way, not the way you're wanting at any time. I'm up to part 3 of painting Carla in the Rose Garden. I did a wash of basically cadmium orange and a little cad red, and I put it on very lightly over the dress, which had been underpainted with a cadmium lemon. Now, I was very careful, even though the dress is a red dress, to not apply the red or red-orange in many places because the lady is sitting outside in the sunshine and the sun is washing out the red, overexposing it if you like, and what you mainly see is a slight tint of lemon. You'll get the feeling that the dress is red without painting the whole dress the colour red. The eye will still read it as a red dress. It's not the best photograph for a portrait because the light is very diffused all over the place. There isn't a clear shadow. I had to actually try to work out where the light is coming from, and it's basically bathing her uniformly. There's only a few areas of shadow. There's shadow underneath the chair, so I'm casting the shadow in the next couple of lessons in the lower part of the painting. But there's a lot of light on her face, her hair, and her dress. So we're just going in and casting shadows into the folds of the dress and a little bit of colour to suggest that it is the red dress. But there's not a great deal of red being applied. I'm still working in the same colours I started with. I used the lemon yellow, and then I used the Viridian green and cobalt blue. And then I came in and started adding a little bit of the cadmium red dark. When I got into painting the flesh and the dress, I used a little bit of the cadmium orange with the cadmium red dark. At some point in the next video, I introduced a bit of cadmium yellow instead of cadmium orange, and it is too yellow. I'm going to need to wash it out. You've got to be very careful when you have a love of colour that you actually don't put too many colours in, more colours than the painting needs. The best paintings often have a fairly limited colour harmony so that your focus is mainly on the light and shade, especially when you've got a very sunlit scene and the colours are washed out. Even with a photograph of that scene, there'd be a lot of washing out of the colour with the bright exposure of the sunlight, which is what you're trying to capture here. The feeling of a lady sitting in a sunlit garden with a rose garden behind. And as I said, a lot of those roses in the rose garden are white roses. So the main focus will be her sitting there with a red dress and that diffusion of white roses behind. We're not wanting a lot of colour. I said at the start that I'd not decided how I was going to treat this chair. It was a green plastic chair, which in itself doesn't sound very artistic, very interesting compositionally, but I said I'd leave it till later in the painting to make my decision whether I would work it up and turn it into a cane chair or leave it the plastic chair. But because there's so much lovely greens behind, do all the yellow, come back and do the introduction of the red, orange, and then the introduction of the green. But I'm doing one piece at a time because I'm dealing with paper that will be drying out as I work, and I'm wanting to have each of these colours I add to merge and blend subtly. So I'm needing the paper to remain wet, and if I try to do the whole section, I may not get back into it while it's wet enough. I'm working fairly slowly, just quietly. There's no need to rush it. So I'm going at a fairly slow pace, and I'm letting you see the pace that an artist would be working at by keeping this in real time.
One of the reasons we need to take breaks in our work is so that we can go away and come back and look at the painting afresh. Now, when I'm putting these bright yellows in here, I did intend to have them subdued to go back into shadow and that's worked out fine for the car shadow behind and under the chair. But I came up the side with a bright yellow and I should have downed the brush and gone for a walk and taken a break, because I sort of overdo the yellow in this part of the painting. And when I come back for my 5th stage of the work, I'm going to have to take a look at that and work out how I'm going to subdue that yellow. And there are many ways that one can do it. And no, I haven't ruined the work, but I have overworked the work in this session. And that comes from not downing those brushes and taking that walk, turning away, turning around and coming back and looking at it fresh. So everything's going well up until this stage. It's just towards the end that you'll see that I just overdo this yellow coming up the side. Just thought I'd mention it, and you can have a look and see where you think I overdo it. Now, we all have the area that we're weakest on, and my weakest area is colour harmony. I get it right most of the time, but like many artists, I have a passionate love for colour, and occasionally I will creep in with that one extra colour that is not needed for a good painting. My light and shade is usually spot on, and my composition is always right, but that's why compositionally I know I've got to cast the lady's legs into shadow, because I don't want to point out of the painting through the legs. But yes, we just got a little bit carried away with that yellow because it worked so well. That's a beginner's era. I'm not, but I'm a beginner, but see, I still make those beginner's mistakes. When you do something and it works, you have a tendency to keep doing it rather than saying that was enough and stopping. And because putting the yellow down on the ground here and then turning it into cast shadow worked, and I just got carried away and overdid my use of the yellow. I'm still happy with the way I've painted this red dress at the moment. Whether I add more red later, I've yet to see. But I'm very happy with the controlled way I painted it, that I didn't just make it a shrieking red dress. The fact that I still have a face ahead of me is a little terrifying. See, I have been painting for decades and I'm still scared of my painting sometimes, especially with watercolour. What I will do is I'm going to take a look at a few other watercolour videos I've done before I do it. Now, the thing is, I actually don't want a portrait. I want a lady sitting in the sunlight, and I want a pattern of light and shade on her face. I don't want details of a structured portrait. I want the whole setting to be the painting, the feeling of the lady in the garden, not the lady as a portrait. So I'm wanting to have light and shade on that face, and it's all bathed in the sun. It would have probably been better to have painted her with a picture hat on. That's how I'd originally planned this scene, was a lady in a lovely straw hat. But, well, my Carla came and sat there and looked just so gorgeous. I did the sketch and took the photos as she was. You can see this where I perhaps got a little bit overboard with that yellow. It wasn't required up through that area at all. It was not needed. So I'll work on that in the 5th session. Not this session, because at this point I haven't woken up that I've overdone things. You can be, what's said, too close to your work. As I said, you need to back away. I like the fact that I'm subduing it here, but when I swung around and had a look at my painting after I got up and left the area, I could see that there was far too much yellow in the scene, far more than was needed. So as I said, the difficult stages ahead for me will be working out what I'm going to do with this face. The realization after the fact that I should have done my sketches in preparation with a hat on the lady so that the face could have been in shadow and submerged, so that it was more the lady in the garden than looking for a portrait with details. No, I haven't overdone things with this red because I'm going to mute it back into shadow patches. So although it's rather shrinking at the moment, it won't stay that way. But yeah, as I said, a couple of little problem areas here. My overuse of that yellow, the fact that I have to cast that leg into shadow, which won't be a problem, and the fact that I should have allowed for a shadow on the face, and I haven't given a reason for a shadow besides, as I said, a branch might be a little bit too obvious. We'll get there. And what they say, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So I had planned out all of this painting except for, as I said, the fact that I'm getting to now closer and closer to this face. I recall, as I said, having paid $500 for a masterclass with one of the best watercolorists in the world. And when it came to doing the face of the nun, even though it was very much concealed in the habit, the flowing robes and the part of the garment across the face, he still flunked the face in front of a big crowd. Well, I only have to flunk the face in front of a small crowd of patrons if I do flunk it, and I don't intend to and I don't wish to. I'm just having a laugh with you that it's natural. It's natural with watercolour to feel the fear, to feel the apprehension, and then jolly yourself out of it. Kid yourself that you're more than up to it, and stop and do a little reference. As I said, what I'll do is I will look at a few watercolor painted faces before I go into this face, and I will get myself all psyched up, full of confidence before I go into that part of it and do it. So at the moment I'm just suggesting foliage that's a different type of foliage to the foliage that I put in to be the foliage of the rose bushes. This is like trees above them, trees off to the side of them, because it's a different colouring, it's a different tone, it's a little bit more muted. The colouring that I'm putting down there for the shadows on the ground, I've introduced those up into the trees too. So when I'm doing a bit of painting, I look around the painting and say, where else did that colour need to go? And that's the way I work. You're always looking at the whole painting. And if you're looking at the whole painting, you shouldn't make errors like I did, where I ended up with too much yellow. I should have seen that that wasn't required. I guess I was hoping that that would fade into the paper and dry duller than it did, but it didn't. It dried fairly bright, and I didn't need that colour intensity. I'm starting to try to build up some of the shadow in the leg now. Just a little bit. It's not going to be enough, but I've started the shading off. More or less like I'll have that sun hitting that kneecap, but the rest of the leg going off into shadow. So we just don't want it to be so vivid coming out. So if we can, we'll look at the dress and up into the lady's face and hair. I'm thoroughly enjoying doing this work, even with my joking about it being a frightening experience. It doesn't matter who you are. Watercolour has that element of being the master. You can't control it. So you have to love that. You have to be a relaxed person, one that can go with the flow to do watercolours, that can look at what happened and have a laugh, shrug their shoulders. I'm just coming in a little bit closer here so that you can see me working around the hair, starting to cast a few shadows into this.
Now I'm continuing to work with the same colours. Blue and orange make a grey, red and green, they make a brown. So I'm just using these same tones and colours together, mixing on the paper, just picking up a bit of one and a bit of another and putting them in there, and you're getting those lovely natural greys. So I picked up a bit of orange and put it down, picked up a little green and put it down into it, and we're getting lovely cast shadows. I'm just going to wish when I get to that face that I had more shadow. We'll see how we get there. I'm enjoying this and it's coming on well.
Try not to think of what you're painting. Don't think I'm painting a face, if that's going to scare you. Think of it as you are painting a pattern of light and shade. You are looking for the tone of the area that you're painting, and you're looking of the shape of the tone, and you're just putting down a shape in a correct tone, and that allows you to paint anything. If you're not sure what the tone is, squint your eyes so you're not seeing all the colour. You're just seeing whether it's light, a medium tone, a medium dark, or a dark tone, and mix up that tone and just look for the pattern of the shape. Try to simplify everything.
Well, how do you paint a lady's face in full sunlight? Carefully. I don't think I've ever painted somebody bathed in full sunlight before, where the light direction is vague and from above. It's not the most flattering pose. It's a heavy cast shadow uh, from lines on the face, from the nose casts a downward shadow. When you are painting anything, it's very important to not worry about the fact that you're painting eyes and nose and mouth. You've got to think in terms of patterns of light and shade. You just break it down to patterns of light and shade. And where the lighting is harsh and not necessarily flattering to the subject, you may need to soften those patterns of light and shade also. So we're going about this carefully and just by focusing on where the shadows are. We're using the same colours we've used in the whole painting. We're using the cadmium orange and the cadmium red mixed together, and we're muting that back with the viridian and or the cobalt blue. So we haven't changed colours. We're wanting to keep this whole painting unified. So we're not thinking in terms that this is blonde hair or flesh colour or, blue-grey eyes. We're thinking in terms of patterns of light and shade. It's working from there. And if the shadow looks cooler, we'd use more blue or viridian. If it looks warmer, we would use more of the cadmium red or the cadmium orange. So just allowing that pattern of light and shade to dictate what goes where. I mentioned before that painting a face in full sun like this is not something that one thinks is going to be an easy job, especially in watercolor where you just don't know how it's going to work out. What do they say? I can't remember who said it, but the suggestion is to do something that scares you every day. I think it might have been Audrey Hepburn who gave that advice. I should look it up. But I don't know about doing something that scares you every day, but if that would certainly apply to doing watercolor and doing figurative work within the watercolor. I'm still happy with how it's going. Giving note to how difficult watercolor is, even for somebody who's an award-winning watercolorist and somebody who has actually watched the best watercolorists in the world do watercolor in front of the public and actually fail at the job, because watercolor by nature, as I keep repeating, is the master, and you can only do your best to try to manipulate that master to do what will be a good, pleasing job. And you've got to be aware that not every watercolor is going to work. That produces an element of excitement and risk or fear to the work if you like. And of course, you can't work if you're frozen by fear. So you've got to relax and have fun. Relax and just let it happen. So things are still going well. I'm happy with it. Certainly, this isn't easy, and I'm aware that the model would like this to look pleasing for her, and I think she's conscious of that photograph where the sun was hitting was fairly extreme on facial lines, and I know that she would not want that. So taking into consideration something that the model would like, as well as what I'm seeing here as far as the light and shade where it's hitting. 3, 2, 1. Where the sun is hitting the face is every photographer's nightmare. If you read articles on how to pose and model, it will always tell you don't put your brightest light directly above, casting that strong light on the nose and the strong cast shadow from the nose coming down over the lips and even, the jaw, casting that big shadow down onto the throat. It is probably one of the worst shots. Another bad shot is lighting from very low upwards, but that's the way it is. And there's a lot of, as I said, you would have a lot of overexposure. You would have those strong shadow lines from the light above, and then you would have the overexposure from that bright light of sitting out there basically in the midday sun to have the light directly above like that. So we have to keep that in mind, and the overexposure can actually be an aid to us. It tells us that we are not to paint this in type detail because you wouldn't see it in type detail with the sun overhead. You've got to try to remember you're capturing the effect of light and shade on objects, not just the objects. It's not the rose garden with a lady in it. It's the effect of the sunlight shining on the rose garden with the lady in it. So we've got to keep in mind that direction of the light. Because we're working from a photograph, as well as sketches that I've done on site, there is some simplification. If I was trying to paint this on site with a model posing in the garden, I'd have the added complication of the light constantly moving because the sun would have moved in a period of time that I would be painting this, and you would go through all different patterns of light and shade on your subject. So in that situation where you're working on plein air, you need to do a very quick, rough block in of everything quickly and then stick with that original concept. Yes, I didn't like what I just did with that eye. I grabbed a tissue while it was still wet and blotted it. I don't often put tissue to my work or blot it, but in that case, it was a lifesaver. Well, in this case, an eye saver. It allowed me to blot out an eye that I was not happy with that last brushwork. One good way to ensure that you don't overwork an area is that you don't keep working at that spot. Move off and work in some other area of the painting and come back to it after you've had a break. Because while you're working in an area, you have a tendency to look at the last brushwork that you've done or the last stroke or mark you made, and you over focus on a single area or a single brushstroke. Whereas when you work away from it for a while and you come back and look at the painting, you see the whole work. You see what you did before in relationship to everything else. It's so much easier to take in the whole painting following a break, whereas while you're actually working up close, you are only looking at that area you're working on. So that's a good move, is to do some of an area and then look where you can use that same tone, the same color somewhere else in the painting. and that working all over the painting, keeping the whole painting in mind, is usually sufficient to stop you overworking in an area or, spoiling an area. It's also a, a stress break. If you're finding an area a little stressful because of how important it is, as in the importance of the face to look like the person, it's a good stress break to move off and do something that's a lot easier to paint. Again, thinking in terms of pattern of light and shade rather than the actual colour. You're looking at the area of light glow from the sun of this hair, and you're looking at the parts of the hair that are shaded. The actual colour of the hair isn't so relevant because the strong light from above and the shadow it casts is going to play the most dominant role rather than the colour of the hair as such. Quite a bit of shade in that gap between the face and the hairline. And just building it up gradually. Don't want to build it up too strongly. I know that whatever you put down does tend to fade, but it isn't always going to fade to the extent that you might need it, like the yellow that I put down remained a little bit too vibrant, and I've needed to work over it with a blue, a cobalt blue, to try to subdue it, and I will do some more too. But something as important as the subtleties of the darks on the face, I'm doing this very gradually, very gradually. This is where having an extremely high quality sable brush is a maximum help. I can depend on this brush. This brush isn't going to go and drop a hair in my painting and spoil an area that I worked hard on, as some of those synthetic watercolorist brushes do. I can completely depend on it. The tip isn't going to fail me. I can work right up on the tip and do as fine a controlled line as you could possibly want. Decided to place Carla's dogs, one either side of her. There's room for them in the painting. We're bringing Kira to the foreground, so Kira will be the larger dog, and Conan has his head on Carla's lap. It still is left for me to do more work on Carla's face and to develop the hands, which are in her lap. And now we're going to have Kira and Conan added to the scene. I think it's going to work really nicely. Now, I want to eliminate as much of the underpainting behind Kira and Conan as I can. Don't attempt this if you don't have a very high quality sheet of paper, because of course you can destroy the surface of the paper. But I'm trying to wet the paper and then soak up some of that pigment where I'm now going to place these very light coloured dogs. Now, because my papers are reasonably good quality watercolour paper, I'm getting quite a lot of pigment out of the paper without doing any destruction of the paper, but I've got to keep an eye on it. I have sketched the dogs in. Once I got the idea, I thought about it for 24 hours. I didn't rush in and do it. I allow myself time to visualise the idea into the work, and I discussed it with several people, my husband, my granddaughter, and Carla. And Carla loved the idea. Now, I sent 2 preliminary sketches of how it might look to Carla, and she and I both chose this one. I have multiple layers now, which is something I like. We've got Kira to the foreground. We've got Conan sitting a little bit behind Carla, but with his head on her knee. That places his head further forward than her head. And then, of course, the rose bush is behind, and then the far off distance a suggestion of out of focus trees. So multiple layers now, a lot of depth into this scene. Very happy with that. Now, I'm not going to get enough pigment out of the paper to get it back to pure paper, so I can't really continue with this as watercolour because there's still too much staining of the paper. So I'm going to need to put an opaque medium onto the paper. So at this point, I have to decide if I wanted to continue in any other medium that would work on paper. And it's still not a clear decision, but I will probably proceed with opaque watercolour, which is gouache. It still remains a watercolour. It just becomes gouache, which is the opaque watercolour. So I'll start off by painting a little Chinese white onto the paper to give it a little bit of a surface. I've tiny little bit of damage to the paper there, but not really enough to be of concern, and still getting more pigment out. So I spent about 20 minutes working on this, just gradually rinsing and rinsing. Another thing I could have done, I could have held the paper under the tap and allowed water to run over this small section where the dog is. However, the risk of doing that would be that I might have washed out paint where I want it to be. And I'm very happy with the dress. I don't want to mess around and risk paper splatters into that area. So this was the safest way for me to do it. If you're doing commission work, it's a good idea to do these preliminary sketches and send various ideas off, like this one here. I've superimposed the two dogs, photographs of the dogs, over the portrait, and I've sent that off to Carla, and that's what she looked at and loved. So that's the guide now, and I'll have that beside me as I continue on and paint Kira and Conan into this painting. I think that will look really good. Now, the dogs won't be painted as you see them there. We're superimposing a new element into a painting that's already started, and the lighting must complement the lighting that's already in the painting. So there's going to be a shadow cast over the body of Conan, Conan being the dog that has his head on Carla's lap. We don't want his body to be in bright focus. We've already thrown a shadow on Carla's leg, so we'll also throw that same shadow across Conan's body. We'll have his head more in focus. We need to develop Carla's hands that are in her lap. Now, Kira, we don't want a lot of focus down around her paws, which are very low down in the painting. So we're going to need to basically shade that too. So we're quite happy with our plan, and we'll proceed with that in the next stage. So here I start putting the opaque watercolour, the gouache, into the painting, the Chinese white. One. A concern that I have at this stage is the possibility of bleed through. Darker colours can bleed through lighter colours, and these dogs are very light in colour, and if I paint them over a underpainting that's tinted darker than the light of the dog, it may work for a print in that you may get a perfect image immediately that would work beautifully for taking a print. But if you were to keep the original for a period of time, that underpainting could bleed through and start showing. That's called pentimento, where the artist has changed their mind. Now, a way around that might be, after I've applied this gouache and it's dried, to seal that surface with a non-bleed through cover, something like perhaps the Schminky Pastel Fix. I could paint that over the gouache painting of the dog. Important not to apply that gouache too thickly, otherwise it could crack. Now, you've got to keep all these things in mind if you want to have an archival quality painting. You can't just experiment. You can't just do anything and hope the painting's going to last. So this gouache covering is going on fairly lightly, not caking it on. I'm putting it on so it will absorb into the paper. And I think I will seal it. And then I could complete the work in, say, pastel pencils or even soft pastels. Even, well, as I said, we could do gouache up to the point where we seal it, because the gouache would need to adhere to the paper, whereas the pastel fix would give a slightly textured surface, which would be more suitable then for going into with pastels. So I've got many ways that I could finish this painting off. The main thing is that I'm going to have to go into an opaque medium because I've made the decision to add things after my initial plan. I hadn't allowed for them and kept that paper pure white. And that's where it's very handy for the watercolourist to have an opaque medium that they can branch into. We don't always plan everything exactly as we wanted it to begin with. And I'm loving the fact that I decided to put the dogs in. The dogs weren't in the garden at the time. The dogs have never been to my garden. But I know Carla loves her dogs. And I just sort of could visualise that in her home element, the dogs would be there. So both her and I like this idea. As I said, I will seal this after this is fully dry and make that decision, have my pastel pencils perhaps on hand very sharp, and consider maybe working with those. I've always loved working with pastel pencils, and it goes back to my portraiture from decades ago. I did a lot of fairly realist portraiture using the pastel pencils. So I think that worked very nicely for these golden retrievers.
And we have the sketch of our two golden retrievers that are being added, Kira and Conan. And I've washed out as much of the underneath watercolour as I can because I'm adding these dogs in based on I could visualise them into the painting and I felt they would work so well with the model. So it's a case of changing my plan. And I'm showing you how you can do this. I've washed out as much as I can, and now I'm sealing this surface so that this remaining stain on the paper will not bleed through. So I'm using the Schminky Pastel Fix, which is a ground suitable for taking pastel medium, but it could be used for any other medium. I could use acrylics on it. I haven't decided 100% what I'm going to go ahead with. I just know that I want to seal the ground so that the stain on this paper cannot bleed through into a future lighter covering. I could also possibly work with watercolour or gouache. I'm not restricted in what I put over this surface. I just need a seal on the paper. So that's our initial point. And there's not a great deal to watch here. This is basically romantic realism, what you're looking at now, if you're wondering what the art styles are. I don't do photorealism. I think if you want something that looks like a photograph, you take a photograph. I like to see brushwork. I like to see the influence of the artist's tools and materials on the work. So I'm just putting the lid back on this pastel fix. I found it very hard to get the lid off. So I'd say with that sort of medium, you need to make sure that you clean the debris. Oh yes, that cup of coffee is very important. I usually either work very late at night or early in the morning, and I'm not going to hide my cup of coffee anymore. We're using one of my range of 3 different complete sets of soft pastel pencils. Now, I'm not sure which brand this one is. I've worked with pastel pencils for decades, mainly when I wanted to do a fairly realistic portrait, because you can get right in there with the details. So I'm just marking in the shadow patterns that will form this dog and helping clear the markings so that you and I can both see where we're heading, for us to follow and see where I'm heading with this. Kira and Conan. So this is Conan with his head on Carla's lap, and this is Kira sitting to the front here. Now, I did not sharpen my pencils. I hear artists talk about needing to work with extremely sharp, fine-pointed pencils. I try not to. I think if I start working with extremely fine points, I'm getting too detailed. I'm not needing that degree of detail into my work. As I said, I'm not a photorealist. I don't want to become a photorealist. I would prefer to have a degree of impressionism to my work, and I actually fight with the tendency to over-tighten. I prefer to keep a little looser. I think it's more romantic. I just love, it's more artistic, more painterly. So the last thing I want is extremely tightly sharp pencils. Also, if I work with that pencil slightly to the side and turn the pencil as I work, I can basically keep a point as sharp as I ever need on the pencil as I work, just by the way I turn the pencil. And would you believe, I have a session about once a year, usually after Christmas, before the New Year, where I spend about 3 days doing art material maintenance, and I'll actually sit down and I will sharpen all of my pencils. And would you believe that takes about 3 days? That's how many pencils I've got. And that pretty well does me for the year. That 1 year maintenance, I have the pencil sharpener on hand, and because I look after my pencils and I buy good quality brands, they don't break, so I'm not constantly breaking leads and needing to resharpen. And as I said, because of the way I work, by turning that pastel on its edge as I go, that's keeping it as sharp as I need. I want to block out another area there. So I'm just putting that masking fluid down a bit further because I'm putting more of the dog's body down there. See, I didn't see changes to the plan as I go. I'm basically at the point where I'm looking at my work all over and letting my painting suggest what it needs. And I can see the dog's tail there. I can see its body in behind its legs. And I'm also going to remove that back leg. I feel that it would be less visible there. I'm working from a range of several photographs to compose what will fit in here. So I'm not actually working from a set photograph and trying to copy it. Also, as I've explained before, I can't paint these dogs as they are in the photograph because it's a different scene. And that's something you've got to be very aware of. If you're trying to put an image from one photograph onto a painting you've started from another photograph, you can't do it as per that photograph. You've got to think of what the light source is in your first painting. It may be in a totally different placement. So you can't light your subject the same way as it is in the photograph. You've got to light it according to how it would be in the scene. So you're constantly working to keep everything unified. Remembering my sunlight is almost directly above. So we're going to need to cast more shadow directly underneath the dog, underneath the dog's chin, all of those things, underneath the dog's nose. And I'm also going to want to stop the eye going out of the painting. Always think of composition, and the way I will do that will be casting a bit of shadow over the body of Conan, that's the dog with its head on Carla's lap, and over perhaps the lower legs and paws of Kira, the dog, to the foreground. and that will come from the branches of the foliage and everything in a tree that would be above and to the front, and that will give me a dappled shadow easing off as we're getting into the light, the sunlight striking the heads of the dogs and bringing the dogs into focus. That will work really nicely with my scene. I'm working with the colour indigo, which is a greyed back, very dark blue. Now I know the dog's eyes aren't blue, but remember we've used, for our shading and cool colours in the watercolour part of the painting, we used viridian green and cobalt blue. We added to those cadmium red and cadmium orange to create the darks and the muted tones. Now we can't suddenly jump in with black or very dark browns. We really need to work with the same colours we've worked with for the whole painting. So the indigo will be equivalent to the dark blue that I've got in the painting that's already been greyed back with a little bit of the cadmium orange or the red. So I'm choosing colours that are already in my work as I move forward to complete the next stage of the work. I don't change my colours. If I did change my colours, I would have to go back and work those colours through all the parts of the paintings that I've already done. That wasn't part of my plan to change the colours. It was just simply to add a new dimension of interest to this work. And I'm pleased that I've done that. I think these dogs are going to just work beautifully with colour.
Now I'm developing these golden retriever dogs into this painting, and I'm using watercolour now. And again, I'll be focusing on the colours that I used in the main painting. I've used the cobalt blue in my shadows, and I've used the cadmium orange and the cadmium red for my warm colours, and I'm using these colours now for the shading in the golden retrievers. Now, I had done a little bit of preliminary work marking in the shape of the light and shade and the line drawing for the golden retrievers, and I had used an indigo Carbocelo pastel pencil. So I'll be liquefying that now with a brush as I work. My art studio area needs a big clean-up. As you can see, I've got the cords from my lights overhanging my paper. So I need to take a big clean-up. I've ordered online from eBay 3 cat deterrent mats. These are similar to the mat that I've got at my front door. It's a transparent piece of plastic that has very fine electrical wires through it that attach to a battery, and the battery puts through a very light electrical current, and you've got an on-off button with it just as well, because I'm going to need to handle them. But it just gives a pet, cat or a dog, a very light single, a deterrent to stop them walking on it. Now I've purchased 3 that are just over the size of my 3 trays of pastels. So when they arrive, I'm going to give my studio a big clean up, and I'll be able to put these cat deterrent mats out over the top of my pastels, a little bit of extra protection for all that investment in soft pastels that I've made. And meanwhile, I have been using a bottle of spray water and spraying the cats when I wanted to keep them off the benches. And I've also used aluminium foil, which you can see just to the right of my painting. You can see the aluminium foil, and I spread that across over my soft pastels or any work in progress that I have on the table that I don't want pets walking on. And that's quite successful. When I work with wet paint, like my oil paints, I have an old cigar box, which dates back pre-World War II. Would you believe? It was my father's. And my mother used it during her profession as a dress designer as her cotton storage box. And now I've taken it for my art career as my wet paint palette storage box. So when I work in oil paint, it's a very shallow box and I paint in it. And then when I need to walk away from my wet painting and my wet paint palette, I just lower the lid and that keeps my cats from going near it. So they're just some of the things that I do to protect my work having pets in the studio. Do feel welcome to ask questions. I've got a lot of experience in art sales, art gallery setups, even selling art online. And if you don't ask questions, I don't know what it is that you're wanting information on. So use those comments to ask your questions. I won't necessarily answer there in the questions, but I'll take note of what it is you want to know, and I can develop those into tutorial videos, and I can reply to you in these videos. Now, one of the things that you're seeing me do here, as I'm emulsifying this pastel pencil that I already have down on the paper, I'm working also with a tissue in my hand, and if the emulsified pencil comes up too strong when it's wet, I'm blotting it, or I'm picking up some of the excess pigment with a brush and removing it from the paper. It's important that I don't end up with it being too dark, because when you wet this pastel pencil, it does show darker than it appears when it's dry. Now, of course, you have got the effect of watercolour soaking a bit into the paper and drying a bit paler, but we've always got to watch that the tone ends up as we want it. So as well as emulsifying this pencil, I'm adding a little bit of cobalt blue into the shadows and some of the cadmium orange and cadmium red dark where I want the warm tones. So I'm adding a little bit of extra pigmented wash, and I'm also just emulsifying the indigo pencil that's already there. Indigo, of course, being a very dark blue, muted blue, just wonderful for the shadows. At each stage of the painting, I always look at the work and I ask, what does it need? Now, things that this painting still need, of course, working up the dogs, which is what I'm doing now. I also need to do quite a lot of work on Carla's face, working on the shadows on the face. I'll be needing to work into the background. Again, I need to do a lot of softening around what are the white rose blooms in the painting. I may put some warmth coming down in the sky that is perhaps picking up the colour that's in Carla's dress. And I also want to eliminate that yellow that's showing in the painting. I mentioned that in previous parts of the painting, that I feel the yellow doesn't work. I'll be toning all of that yellow back. So they're the things that I assess when I look at the painting and say, what does it need? It still needs quite a lot. So there's no issue of what shall I do next. It's a case of saying, what does the painting need? And it's still responding, and I'm very clear on what the painting needs. So while that's all happening, I'm very happy with the painting. What's taking place already is working, and those things that I'm not happy with, I'm very clear on what I need to do. So watercolor's tricky because, as I said, it's a transparent medium, and you can't be sure how it's going to work out in the end. Watercolorists need to learn to be very strong and know when a watercolor isn't working. That's my light. My cat's around, and my cat just knocked one of my lights. As I said, I have a couple of companion cats, studio assistants. That's why I'm mentioning some of those deterrents one needs to have if one has pets in the studio. So, as I said, at this stage, I'm very clear on what to do. But with watercolor, you always have to be prepared that it might not work, and you may need to go in to your work with some opaque medium if you don't quite end up with exactly what you want. But so far, we're progressing well. But I am allowing for the fact that I may need to use a little opacity towards the end to finish this off. But we're going well quite at the moment. But always say, what does my painting need? Don't ever say, what more can I do? Because then you'll start fiddling. Now, I'm working with a pure sable watercolor brush. It has a beautiful point. I always find the natural hair will carry a lot more fluid than any of the synthetic brushes. I know I keep repeating this, but I do love a quality brush. I'm working with Winsor & Newton paints, and I have underpainted these golden retrievers using an indigo Carbothello pastel pencil. Now, I planned these golden retriever paintings after I had done the painting of Carla in the rose garden. Well, when I say had done the painting, had done the block-in of the painting, because there is still more to be done to it. I basically visualized them into the painting. I liked the idea, discussed it with Carla. She thought it would be a lovely idea. I did 2 sketches or preliminary block-ins, one where the dogs were a little bit further back and one where they are in their current position, showed them to Carla and the family, and we discussed it and we chose this pose. So when you're planning to work with a client, you want to show them the various drafts that you have. What I did there is I just blocked out what I'd just done with a tissue. If you put a bit of watercolor down and it's a little bit darker than you want it, you can grab a clean cloth, clean acid-free cloth is best, maybe a bit of terry toweling and blot up. You can use a tissue if you don't want the work to be a very high archival quality. It's best to use rag for rag content. If you start adding acid-containing paper to your work, you can ruin some of the acid-free aspect of a painting. But most artists do blot with tissue. They don't seem to worry too much about the potential of adding any acid to the paper with the tissue. I used to always use a well-washed piece of terry toweling as my preferred way of blotting out. I'm watching that I match the shadows of the dogs to the shadows that are in the paintings. When you combine photographs, you can't necessarily copy the light and shade that's in the photograph. You have to focus on the light and shade that would be in your work, because you may have light in different directions in each of the different photographs. So I planned that. That's why I did the sketch with a Carbothello pencil, so that I could lay down where my light and shade would be, so that when I came in and started painting, I would already have the light and shade pattern planned. I'm using cobalt blue and the cadmium orange are my main colours that I'm working with. The cadmium orange has almost a reddish orange-red tint. It's not a yellow orange. It's just ideal for this work. And I'm really enjoying putting these dogs in. I'm glad I made that decision. I think because I know Carla well and I know these dogs well, that's part of what really helped me visualise the dogs in the scene, and I knew that it would work. I'm dipping into the cobalt blue there. I want to add a little bit extra shadow and also a tint of colour into the shadow. Dipping into a little bit of cadmium red where I want to darken it, mute it, make it more of a very dark tone for marking out the eyes. So I'm getting towards the end of this 10th stage of the painting. I'm just starting to want to increase some of the darks around the face so that when I leave it at the end of this stage, these dogs are more fully developed and I can step back and assess how the work's coming. So just a few little details around the nose and the eyes and the mouth before I finish this stage of the painting. And then I'll go back and probably work into the background and start neutralising some of that yellow. It's good to try to work all over the painting, not just try to work and finish off an area like a face or something. That's why I've still got part of Carla's face I need to go back and work into. It's good to be focusing on the whole painting, not trying to detail up one area and maybe have it end up being out of context with the remainder of the work. As I'm working, I'm thinking, these dogs, they don't smile. You don't realise when you start painting them that you're looking at these lines that are hanging down, and I'm thinking, oh, come on, smile for me, dog. Yeah, I'll end up. I think we need to work with getting the smile into the eyes. And remember those heads on the lap. That's planned afterwards. They weren't there in the original scene that I saw on location in my garden. So I'm going to have to remember to cast a shadow beneath that dog's chin as it sits on the lap of Carla. So you will have to extend down below that chin, just with a little bit of shadow on that sunlit dress. This is Kira. And again, there's a little bit of blue tint to the shadow and the cadmium orange or cadmium red tint to the sunlight. And of course, that's matching up the same colours that are in the rest of the painting. A little bit of cadmium orange glow on the nose and the warmth of the nose. So even where a nose is black, where the light hits it, it will glow with warmth. So you don't just paint the nose black because it's a black nose. You have to look for the part of it that would be lit by the sun and the part of it would be shaded. So you're painting the effect of light and shade on the dog, not just the dog. You can't just say the hair of the dog is cream, so we paint it all cream. You can't say the nose of the dog is black and paint it all black. If you do that, you don't capture the dog. You're trying to capture, always looking for the light and shade and painting that light and shade. And having chosen the colours of the painting, you're repeating those all around the painting. My paper for this work was a sheet of Artistico Fabriano 300 gram paper, which is a good quality brand paper. I wouldn't want to tackle a work with the complexity of this subject on a cheap piece of paper. You want to give yourself at least a halfway decent chance if you're choosing a subject with a lot of work in on it. I'm using the Winsor Newton pan paints. My favourite paints are the Mary Blue, which are my tube colours. But I'm finding these pan paints are excellent for demonstrating with because you're able to see the palette more easily if I'm working with a tiny palette with my work. I always use, as I said, the natural hair. So this is the Pure Stable brush, all quality materials. I don't need to go down below the size of a size 7, even when I'm trying to do fine hair. Even though I could turn around and use a triple O brush for very fine hair, but I can get right up onto the point of this brush. That was my big lights caving down on me again. As I said, I have cats in the studio and they knock my light over periodically. I've invested in a 3 lots of little cat scat mats, which are little battery operated mats, will give a little bit of a tingle to the cats, and I'll be able to put them around my artwork, and that will soon discourage cats from getting up on my workbench because they're just getting a little bit too confident and trying to get up here and help me with my work a bit too much lately. I wet my palette by spraying it with water before I start a new painting session. I'm wetting a synthetic brush and rubbing it into a cake of soap because I intend to put more masking fluid. I'm using the Winsor Newton Art Masking Fluid, and I'm masking out some of the areas where I want the light coloured rose blooms. Now, I'm going over areas that are white and also areas that are very pale greens or pale blues, because some of these roses will be partially in shadow, so they won't be completely white. But what I'm wanting to do is to darken some of the background so that there'll be more focus put on Carla and the 2 dogs. And I needed to go back in and mask out. Now you can mask over pure white paper, or you can mask over paper that's already been treated with a watercolour wash. It's best if you put this on fairly thick because we're needing to rub it out once it's fully dry and you've done the painting over it. And it's going to be a lot easier to rub out if you put it on relatively thickly. It's important to get all of it rubbed off because if you leave any there, it's going to yellow and stain the paper over a period of time. It's also very hard to get it off if you don't get it off, say, in a reasonable amount of time. I tend to like to complete anything that's had masking fluid on within the week after I put the masking fluid on. Now, the masking fluid can be quite damaging to your brush, and that's why I'm using a less expensive synthetic hair brush to apply the masking fluid, and it's also why I rub the brush into a cake of soap before I apply the masking fluid. That soap is going to help me remove the masking fluid out of the brush afterwards and not ruin the brush. I've seen some people actually dip the brush into liquid detergent. I haven't tried that technique, and there's always something to learn. Now I'm just going back in with the Pure Sable brush and emulsifying some of that indigo pastel pencil that I put into the shadows in the around the fingers, around the arms of Carla. I hadn't done that as yet. I put down the indigo pastel pencil when I marked out the dog shape, and I did it for the arms and the fingers, but I hadn't gone in and emulsified it on Carla. I had only worked it on the dogs. So that was one little touch that I needed to get back and fix. There still will be quite a bit that I'll need to do.
I'm working in the background, doing a bit of a wash using the colour that I'd used in Carla's dress. This helps unify the painting, having the colour appear all over the painting.
I'm working back into these rose bushes and said I needed to darken that area behind, bring more focus onto Carla. I used the cadmium orange for that glow behind. I'm using cobalt blue for my blues, and I'm using viridians. And that's the 3 colours that I'm working with entirely for this painting. I've worked very hard to kill back some of that yellow, which I put into the painting earlier in the piece and then regretted. That's the importance of planning your colour harmony and sticking with it. The more I have worked into these roses, I really feel they've improved and they're far more natural now. You can tell that there's a flower garden behind, and because that flower garden is fairly high, some of those flowers are fairly large. It's not hard to sort of suggest without stating it absolutely clearly that these would be tall rose bushes or perhaps climbing roses that are behind Carla without my having to explain it by putting any one of these into really crisp focus, which would take the attention away from the main subject, which is Carla and her dogs. I'm still thoroughly enjoying doing this work. I'm also have many different ways that I could finish this work off. I could finish this work off purely in watercolour. I could take pen and ink to it, and I could pen and ink into it. I could work in gouache. I could work in pastel, although I don't really feel it lends itself to that. I could go into colouring pencils and I could go into pastel pencils. Now, what I'm doing here, I have a little mark on the paper, and I'm just going over that mark with some watercolour. I have rather think that my cat might have helped me paint a little bit of it because I don't remember putting that mark that I was covering up on. I am really looking forward to when my cat deterrent mats arrive to keep remembering that this is watercolour. It should be kept free and loose and not too tight, not too detailed. You don't want to lose that feeling of it being watercolour. And I do have a choice of if I develop this into mixed media by adding a pencil or pen towards the end, but at this stage we're still predominantly watercolour, so I'm liking that feeling. I've killed back that yellow that I didn't like. That's worked well. I've brought back the colour scheme as it pleases me. I've got my aerial perspective into the work, and we're towards the detail stage, and we don't want to over detail with watercolour. So we need to really look at it now, um, work out if my darkest darks are right, if my lightest lights are right. I can work in both those areas. I can increase some of my darks for just minor details on my main focal point, which of course will be Carla and the dogs, and a little bit of highlighting, I think predominantly on the dogs there. And there should not be too much more work that needs to be done. I think it's important not to do too much, that we don't want a tight work. So we are at the point where you need more look than put. That's an important phase. It's something that the amateur will make the biggest error on. They will try to rush in and finish the work without sitting there and looking at it, taking your time, looking at the work, letting the work tell you what it needs. So you don't do those finishing touches until the work has actually spoken to you. As I said, I'm looking for those areas where I need to intensify the darks at the moment. I'm not working in the most essential parts, like around the eyes and details like that. I'm looking at less important parts that are just part of the complementary areas, the secondary important areas, and just a little bit of shading there from Carla's body on the chair, down the side of the dog, under the dogs, that type of thing. We'll just increase those, and we're creating those darks with the opposites, the ultramarine blue, cobalt blue, viridian greens can be used for the cool colours, and I'm using the cadmium orange for the warm colour, mixing those together with the cooler colours, and we're getting interesting browns and greys. And we're mixing on the paper So we're not just getting one cold, hard colour. We're getting a nice variety into those greys. Sometimes those greys appear more green, sometimes more blue, sometimes more orange. And that's how they would be in nature, not just one hard, cold grey. So that's what I call luminous greys, where the greys radiate the colours that they're mixed with. So a little bit more shading in the shadow where her dress will fall into the shade underneath there. So we're just intensifying little bits of light and shade. As I said, it's towards the final stage. I haven't got the reference photo out at the moment. I'll certainly do that for the next stage of the painting. And I can't be sure how many stages are left, but one would hope that we're very close at this point. And as I said, it's very important not to rush things. There's a little bit more shadow on her face. And, this has to be put in very carefully. And so important not to overwork things. And this is where I'm considering what other mediums I might work into the face to get any detailing, or whether to leave it like this overexposed by bright sunlight without any detailing. So we'll take our time and think about those things. 2-1. Because I need to be so sure of what I'm doing when I'm working around the face, I'm working with my best brush, the Pure Sable, that comes up to a beautiful point. It's a Da Vinci, the Winsor Newton Series 7, number 7. That's considered to be one of the best of the Pure Sable brushes. And if you're after a brush like that, keep an eye out for specials, because you can often get them at a good 25% off recommended price. And the Da Vinci, they also very comparable in quality, if not superior. I'm drying this down. I want to get to and rub out the masking fluid now. Now, I like to use my hands to rub out the masking fluid. I like to feel it and get it off with my hands. If you use an eraser, you can't feel. If you're, using, you could use white bread, you could use an art gum eraser, but you can't feel what you're doing. And if you use clean fingertips, you can feel how much pressure to apply. It's very important to get all of that art masking fluid off. If you leave any, it will yellow and it will spoil the look of the painting. I think that was quite a good idea for softening down those roses. It definitely improved it doing another wash over them. Doesn't take long, but you just need to take your time. The better the quality of the paper, of course, the more suitable it is for applying things like the art gum masking fluid, and you're being able to rub it out. Better quality paper will take all the work you need to do for a good watercolour. Cheap paper, it's very hard to build it up in layers and to do all this extra work. That's why it's just worth paying that little bit extra in getting quality paper. I'm using Artistico by Fabriano. That's my favourite paper. This is one of their lighter weight ones. I have it in various weights, and I also have it in cold pressed, which is very textured, and I have it in hot pressed, which is smooth. I'd be inclined to use the smooth one if I was wanting to do a lot of pen and ink work, fine lines, whereas I like to use texture for most of my watercolour work. Toby gets to introduce this one because the start of it concerns dealing with pets in the studio. Now, I've set up my 3 main trays of pastels, and the extra soft pastels have all been combined together. The Senneliers and the Schminkies have been combined together in each of 3 trays. One of my trays is predominantly for flower painting, one predominantly for portraiture, and one predominantly for landscape. Now, I've bought this non-stick paper in the large roll. It's a kitchen product, and this here is a pet trainer mat, which I bought online. I bought 3 of them, approximately the size of each of these wooden trays, which contain my pastels. Now, I got very fast delivery because I only ordered them the other day, and they've arrived at my door, which is unusual because I live very out of the way on a private country road, and we have very few deliveries here. They mainly go to the post office for us to pick up. So it was amazing to get it delivered right to the door and put it straight into use. Now they take a battery, and it's a very easy push button to turn it on, and there's 3 settings: low, medium or high. I don't know which one we're going to need to deter the cats. I've put it on medium, and when I touch it, I can't feel it. Now, I did a bit of preliminary looking at watercolour portraits before I got straight into this watercolour for the final stages, because I'm going to need to work on the face. This is a portrait I painted of my other daughter. This is a portrait I painted of one of our dogs many years ago, and a hand, and there's the legs. Now, I'm showing you these because I'm painting those things again. So here's Carla, the younger daughter, and I'm painting it with her dogs. So I did a little preliminary looking at watercolour portraits. Now I've wet the face again, and then I'm just going in with the same colours. I'm using the blue and the green for the cool colours, and I'm using the cadmium orange for the warm colours, and I'm still a long way from having this face done. So too soon to critique it, but this is how you work, very gently. I'm working with a pure stable brush. I can rely on it. If you have a brush you can depend on, and you know that that point is going to do what you want it to do, you've got a far better chance. It's not something to rush. You just take your time. As I said, the paper is wet and it will be partially drying as I work. And I'm just taking little bits of the dark, dropping them into the damp paper so I'm not getting any hard edge, and going back a little bit more pigment, dropping it in. You can see how far high quality watercolour goes. You don't need a lot of paint. Those pans of colour there, I don't know when I last filled them up, because I'm just working with tiny little bits of pigment. So it's not like oil paint where you're putting out enough to, say, cover a 20-cent piece in each colour for the painting. You're using very small amounts. And as I said, I'm a long way from having developed this face. Now, my setup here, I've got my drawing board with my watercolour on it. It's Artistico Fabriano paper, about 300 gram. I've got my pure sable brush. I've got a container, a little jar that's got my other brushes that I might use for this work, plus a little bit of white gouache. I've got my jug of water, and I've got my Winsor & Newton travel kit watercolours. Besides that, I've got my small portable computer, and I've got an image of Carla in the garden up on the screen. That's probably the easiest way for me to work these days, without photographs, just to pop something up on the computer screen. As I said, there's still a long way to go with this. We're just still just blocking in shadows. You're looking for the shadows and seeing where they go. And I'll be building this face forward, working from the darkest dark through the mid-tones, through medium light to the final lights. So at this stage of the painting, we're just putting in some of the darkest darks, and I'll put in some of the lightest lights with a tiny bit of gouache paint before I finish this session. But then I'll need to go right back again and work through it again. And of course, we've barely started on the dogs. So quite a lot of work still to be done. And you notice that I slow right down at this stage. It's not a stage to rush. So we're looking for where that the shadow shape around the neck, that's going to help define the shape of Carla's neck. If you get all of your shadow shapes right, the portrait will end up looking right. It's just a case of being patient and looking for a tone, getting a tone on the brush and looking for where that tone goes. So there's no need to worry with a portrait. Don't start thinking I've got to do an eye or I've got to do a mouth. You don't think of it that way. You're thinking of the tone. I have this tone. Where do I put this tone? As you can see, I'm still going to need to get a lot of shadow across the lower part of Carla's face. But for the moment, we're just working for these medium dark tones that pop in around the edges of her face, under her chin, and just build them up gradually. So anyway, I got these, talking about the pastel trays again. I had already condensed all my Sennelier pastels into their 3 trays, unwrapped all the paper off of them so that they were easy to use. I stood them up slightly in the trays so they were easy to grab. I had them broken in half so that they're a nice manageable size. Some of them are already down into sections of 3. I had a problem with my cats wanting to walk over them, hence having ordered the cat deterrent mats. Now with my Schminky Extra Soft pastels, I'd condensed the cardboard half box set and the timber box set together into the one box set. Well, as I only ordered the 3 mats, I decided today to do a bit more housekeeping, and I condensed all my Schminky pastels up with my Sennelier pastels. They're both of the Extra Soft quality range. So there is a difference in working with them, but they're similar enough that they can be combined into one painting. So I combined my trays. It was just a case of piling up where I had the same colour to a double layer, and that condensed the spread in my studio. So now we still have the 3 boxes. We've got, as I said, the pastel box, the flower painting box, and the landscape painting box. And it's all combined, all my extra soft pastels, all combined in them. And then I put the non-stick paper out on top, and then I put each of these cat deterrent mats on, put the battery in, turn them on, set them on medium. They haven't been tested by the cats as yet. When I touch them, I can't feel anything yet. So it will be a very, very mild tingle if the cats feel anything. And if they don't, well, I can try the higher setting. But we'll just take it gradually and see what happens. But the idea is to discourage the cats from walking on my soft pastels. And as I have my soft pastel trays at either side of my drawing bench where I work, where I'm working now with this watercolour, that should also provide a safe zone that my cats won't walk through right where I work, because at the moment I've been picking up and putting away this watercolour between sessions because I don't want the cats to go walking on it. So look, they're just the practical things of working with pets. Now the beauty, of course, of working with pastels or watercolour or drawing mediums with pets is that you don't have to worry about hair getting into the surface of the paint. I've changed down to an O brush now. It's still a pure sable, so it's picking up a generous amount of paint. I put out a tiny amount of gouache, and I'm putting down a couple of highlights using the opaque gouache. Now, I still haven't finished shading this face, but we're taking our time with it. We're building it up in layers. So we went from the very darkest dark to the very lightest light. Now we're moving on to get some of the shading into the arms and some of the fingers. At this stage, they're only just very lightly marked out. So the predominant areas that we've still got to work will be Carla's face, the hands, the dogs, and I'll be doing a little bit more work into the background, but not a great deal. Again, I'm wetting all the areas that I'm going to work on, and that means that I'll be initially working wet into wet. So when I pick up pigment, I'm putting it down onto paper that is already wet. So I put down the brushwork, and that brushwork will start bleeding away into the previously wet areas. Now, as I didn't wet the dress, it won't bleed into the dress. It'll just bleed upwards into the arms. That will give a very nice natural curving of this shadow. You'll have the hard edge of the shadow on the arm up against the dress, but then you'll have it just subtly blending away. And that, of course, is the beauty of watercolour, is allowing the water to do a great deal of the painting. That is the whole essence of watercolour, that you don't do it, that you wet your paper, you put down your pigment, and you allow the watercolour to do it. Again, I'm still working with my same colours. I pick up a bit of the orange, I pick up a little bit of the blue from the palette, colours that I've already used in the painting. They're there, dried on the palette, and they're very easy to emulsify. Tiniest little bit of moisture on the brush, and it emulsifies, and I can pick it up. I don't need it so strong that I need to dip into the pans at this stage. Just the residue that's left on the palette will go a long way. And we're marking out where these fingers are. We've got the hands clasped together. We've already outlined them lightly using the indigo Carboncello pencil. And turn that into a wash by adding wash to it. And now I'm coming in with the actual watercolour. And when we finish this, you should get the feeling that these hands are clasped in her lap. Now we're dealing with foreshortening. Foreshortening means that a part of the figure is forward and a part of the figure is at the back. And therefore the part that's at the front is going to look greatly magnified in size to the part that's behind. The arms, the forearms won't be the length of the forearm because they're on an angle. And so they are what you call foreshortened. So they're not the proportions your mind might say they should be. They are the proportions your eyes sees them to be. So a lot of painting and drawing is seeing things as they are and not seeing things as your mind tells you they should be. The mind would tell you that these hands in Carla's laps should be smaller because these clasped hands are quite large compared, say, to the size of Carla's shoulders. And your mind knows that they would be smaller, but your eyes see them the actual size they are. So you're painting something, the shape that your eyes see. I'm trying to put a little bit of the wispy hair now, and to get it to show strands of hair, I've picked up a little bit of the opaque gouache and mixed it with a little bit of the cadmium orange, and we can now cast just a few, not many, hairs blowing in the wind with the breeze, just overlapping the background. Now, if we'd wanted to detail this to any great extent, we would have needed to darken that background so that strands of hair would have shown in more detail. But we're not really wanting to make the hair of Carla a dominant part of the painting. So we didn't need to make the background any darker. The background actually is a major part of this painting. So we don't want to cast it back into dark shadow. I'm picking up some of the colour from Carla's dress, the cadmium orange, and I'm putting that into some of those roses. But in the photograph, there actually were apricot roses off to the side of the white roses, and I was looking at the photograph at the start of this painting session before I got into painting more of Carla's face, and I saw those roses there with the colour, and I thought that they would look really nice, add to the repeating of the colour throughout the painting. I still want to have a lot of white roses, but I thought I'd just do a nice cluster of the apricot. This is a pure sable fan brush. Now, I don't know where I got these brushes. I've had them for years. It's so old, I've had to put a new handle on it. Somewhere along the line, I lost one. I got two. Oh, many, many years ago, probably 40 years or more ago. And I treasure this brush. I don't often use it. It's tucked away. I had to have a search for it. I knew it would be perfect for laying down some of the fine hairs, the golden retriever, just where the light catches them in the garden with a bit of natural sunlight. Um, yes, well, I decided today that given that with yesterday's activities, I only got one painting session in the evening, I would try to start my painting sessions earlier in the morning. Well, of course, the downside of that is I hadn't had enough cups of coffee, and instead of turning 7 lights on to illuminate my painting, I only turned 5 on. Now, one would think that that would be enough, but you'd be surprised how much daylight lighting one needs to eliminate all shadows when you're painting. And, well, I missed 2 important ones, so I hope you'll forgive me. Multiple hairs at one time. You need to dance the brush around. It's practice. Don't just pull it directly down in one position. You need to change the position. Sometimes you need to just get up onto a couple of hairs. You don't have to have this brush to do the job, but it's a very convenient brush for this particular job. And as I said, I very rarely use the brush, but I look at the subject and let the subject suggest to me how it needs to be painted. And, well, my subject suggested get that fan brush out. You could do it with a hog hair fan brush, but of course you wouldn't have the lightness of touch that you get with a pure sable. I am, of course, working with opaque watercolour now, gouache, because I felt that the lightest, brightest hairs of the golden retriever were lighter than my paper. The paper I work with is off-white, creamy coloured. So when I want to get a really bright white, I do need to use opaque gouache to achieve that. So I'm really working through studying where the darkest darks are on the golden retrievers and where the lightest lights are at this point of the painting. This is where you cannot use a formula on how to draw a face or any subject, because each of these dogs has a different character. They don't fit a formula where, the eyes are so far down in the head and then the nose must be so far down again. And also those rules that one may read or be shown, they don't apply to how you tilt the head. They don't apply to the sideways movement or the up and down movement where you've got foreshortening, and certainly they don't show the variation of character of each dog, because Conan, that I'm painting now, has a head nothing at all like Kira's head. So this is where you must look for the pattern of light and shade in your subject and focus on putting those patterns of light and shade in. And that's how you get likeness in a portrait. And with watercolour, you need patience. You need to allow the water to do it. If you work on slightly damp paper, then the brush mark that you put down will bleed slightly. And that's perhaps useful for around the head here, but where I was putting those hairs in, I wanted to have a little bit of crisp edge. And so I worked with a dry brush work. That's where I had fairly dry paint on my brush, and I put it down onto dry paper. So that was basically a dry brush stroke. Now, to be skilled at watercolour, you need to master each of the 4 main ways of working with your paint. You have wet on wet. That's where you load the brush with a very wet wash and you put it down onto very wet paper. And then you can have dry on wet, and that's where you put down a fairly dry brush stroke, whereas I have now, where the brush is loaded up with paint but not much water, and you put it down onto wet paper. And then you have basically, you've got the dry on dry, as we're doing now, where the paper is relatively dry and my paintbrush is relatively dry because I'm putting down highlights, and so I'm looking for a fairly crisp edge with those highlights. I've changed back to my pure sable pointed brush here, and now I've come in with a very fine, probably about a 0 pure sable brush, and I have wet the paper so that when I put these dark marks in, they're bleeding out. So this again becomes almost wet because it's not a wash, it's a damp brush being put down onto damp paper. And so the edges of the shadow that I put down bleed off into a soft line, and then I can pull those shadows into that damp paper to soften the line further, because those shadows need to be built up gradually. You do it gradually because it's not easy to remove paint with watercolour. So when you're building up darks in a area as sensitive as a portrait, where you don't want to come on too strong and then find that you've perhaps put down the dark too intensely and it needs removing, you would build the darks up very, very gradually. And you watch how much it bleeds away. And you've just got to control that water a little bit, but you've also got to allow the water to be doing it. You mustn't be too controlled. You don't want hard edges. You don't want it stylized. You want to have a natural look, and you need it to show that the water has done a lot of the painting by the subtle merging as the paint bleeds out into that dampened paper. Again, we're wanting to get the characteristics of the dog. We're needing this dog to look like Kira. So we keep referring back to the image we're working from of Kira, and we're gradually building up. And again, we're still working with the colours that we've worked with for the whole painting. These are the colours that are over on the palette from where we did the initial block in. So the cobalt blue and the rudian green are forming the basis of our darker cool colours, and the cadmium red and the cadmium orange are forming the basis of our warm colours. And we know by now that if we combine those colours together, we're going to get greys or browns, depending on the variation of them. Sometimes they'll look like a blue-grey, sometimes they'll look like a warm red-brown. It just depends on the combination of those shadow patterns that we're putting together using those colours. And as I said, we've got to build this up very gradually. And we're working, as I said, onto the damp paper because we don't want these dark marks to form hard, unnatural, sharp edges. We're focusing very carefully on where the pattern of these shadows go. It's not something you can rush. Things like the white of the eye, they're misnames. The the white, the lighter part of the eye is not white. It perhaps is a blue-grey, but it's definitely not white, and it's never the lightest part. The eye is always in shadow. You can't stare at the sun. Your eyebrow is there to cast your eye in shadow if the sun is directly above you. You know yourself, if the sun's glaring in your eye, you'll put your hands up to shade your eye. Therefore, you're never going to have the white of the eye looking white. So don't worry too much about preserving the white in the eye. You can't rush this. As I said, it's a gradual referring to the subject you're painting, looking for the dark. If you're working through the darks, look where the dark is, and then back to your subject. Look where it's different, and then put your darks in to match what you see in your subject. So portraiture is very much a thing of looking at your subject, looking at your paper or your canvas, assessing what is different as regards light and shade. And if you see something as darker in the subject you're painting, you look for that spot on your paper or your canvas and you make it darker in that spot. You try not to think in terms of this is an eye, this is a nose, this is a mouth. You try to think in tones of patterns of light and shade. How long would you estimate to take to do a painting like this? Well, if I was teaching intermediate to advanced students in a 3-hour class, I would probably allocate 2 3-hour classes for them to complete a work like this, with me demonstrating alongside them aspects of the painting and constructively critiquing as they go. And it's possible that some students might have needed 3 by 3-hour classes to complete the work, and some of my more advanced students might have been near completing it in 1 3-hour class. And if I was demonstrating it at my peak, I probably would have completed most of the painting in the 3-hour class demonstration and maybe gone back to a couple of touch-ups in another one. We're looking to get the tone we want, the tone being more important than the colour, although we're more likely to have the cooler colours in the darker tones, that would be your blues or your greens, and we're more likely to have the warmer colours, the red or the orange, in the lighter tone areas. So we're just undercutting now, a bit of shadow under the tail, a little shadow under the body, a little shadow under the base of the feet, and we will have finished this session of working on Kira and Conan. We're trying to get a little bit darker, so we've hit back into the pan paints, combining the cobalt blue, the cadmium red, trying to get a much darker tone because we're just going for shadows, just undercutting the dog there. Turn the overhead camera on. We're filming. And I shall wet the face. Put it on, it runs out into the wet paper. We keep an eye on it. We look for where else that goes while we're in. Okay. Now, while we took our eyes off that, we've got to come back and check it because, of course, the colours can be bleeding while you're not watching. And they may not go where you want them. Again, check how damp that is. It's still fairly damp. That's good because we don't want hard edges here. Putting it dark down, keeping an eye on the whole area we're working so nothing dries harsh and hard where we don't want it. And again, we're looking for these darks. Now here we have what's called a lost edge. You have the shadow to the side of the face and the hair not fully defined because that bit of face is in shadow, as is the hair. So we don't want that shadow to bleed too far into the face, but we just need a soft edge there. Okay, that's working. There's a lot more shadow in over those eyes. Eyes tend to tuck themselves away into shadows. So let's just look for the shadow shape. Don't look for the eye. You're not trying to paint an eye. You're trying to paint the shadow shape. And you've got to be ready to wipe out if it goes where it's not meant to go. We don't want too much shadow up there on the forehead. That worked. Always do a little happy dance when something you're doing with watercolour works. Because remember, the watercolour's the master. Now we come in and tuck in a bit darker there. And again, I'm doing it with this cool tone. I'm using the cobalt blue. I can fairly well work with what's left on my palette from doing the main block into the work, but occasionally I dip a bit, increase that shadow there over that eye. Going to be a lot more realistic. Okay, still building up into the shadows. If you don't like a line, if you think it's too hard, you can reach in there with ideally, a bit of acid-free cloth. We're still building patterns of light and shade because it's getting those patterns of light and shade right that are going to be what will make your subject look like your subject and not a human caricature clone. It's this advice to draw a series of lines and ovals and follow some pre-planned pattern that ends up looking like a human that does not help you paint portraits because people are all different. And you can't measure the proportions of a head out, according to line, unless you're not paying attention to that individual person. Seem to have lost this mouth. Take your time, don't rush it. Got an upper lip here to come in somewhere. Just look for the pattern of light and shade. Don't look for the lip. Look for where that shadow is. If the shadow's warmer, you go into a warmer colour. If it's cooler, you go into a cooler colour. You're putting down the shadow and you're leaving the highlights as the white of the paper as long as you can. And as I said, you can't rush it. Keep repeating that, looking for that shadow. You don't look for the edge of the lip, you look for the shape of the shadow. Another shape of the shadow. It's a warm shape. Where else might you have that? A little bit here. Don't think of it what it is that you're painting. Start thinking about it being a cheek or a lip. You start stressing over the shape of it, and you start looking for the shape of the object rather than the shape of the shadow. If you get your lights and shades in the correct place, you will end up achieving what it is you're striving to paint. If you try to draw out a lip, you are going to end up with some artificially stiff, stylized thing that is not a portrait of the person. John Singer Sargent said that a portrait is a painting with something wrong with the lip. And I think that's because we try to draw them as in the shape of a lip rather than the shape of a shadow. Now, if something starts to become a little bit of a pain to work on for a while, if you feel like you need a break from it, have a break from it. Take a look where else you could be working in those tones. And again, I'll come in and I'll wet these hands, and then while they're wet, I'll start coming in and adding in my lights, which can be achieved by wiping out if you have perhaps paint where you feel you don't need paint, and my shadows. And if that shadow bleeds away too quickly, then you have to wait until that paper dries down a tiny little bit more. Try it again. And if that shadow bleeds away too quickly, we come back a little bit later. Now that worked fine. Try again, another finger, the shadow of that finger, the shadow of this finger. And we've got the clasped hands appearing. And it's all in proportion to the shadows that are happening on the face. Because we moved away and started painting in another area, we don't have the shadows happening unnaturally in the face. Here, I'm putting the shadow down onto dry paper that I can come back in, bring the brush out a little bit, damp, and dampen the next stage of that arm. Wipe some of that off, dampen the next, and I can start trying to contour it, produce a bit of a contour effect on that arm. Rinsing the brush, wiping out as I come back. I'm trying to achieve the curvature of that arm. That edge there is a little bit strong. I just soften that edge with a brush, moving it like that into that line of shadow. Now that works. Okay, let's have a look at this mouth, the shape of the shadow. We have fairly strong line there, dark. Got her lips slightly parted. Underneath the top lip is a fairly strong dark patch there. Now, again, the teeth are not white because the teeth are in the recess of the mouth and they're shaded. Now, the mouth slightly apart, but the teeth recessed. You're not going to see pearly whites there. There's a laugh line. Pop it in. Shouldn't have thought of it as a laugh line. Should have thought of it as a little shadow. Okay? I'm always having to discipline my own thinking as I paint, especially if you haven't done something for a while. In a while since I've done a watercolour portrait. I think watercolour is the most exciting and the most challenging art mediums. It is challenging because the water is the master, as I keep repeating, and you can't be sure what it will do, which is the way it should be. Oh, that's looking good. Now, praise yourself. Don't be afraid to compliment yourself. Especially if somebody gives you a compliment when you're painting, or a compliment of your painting when it's done. Don't gush and say, do you really think it's all right? Can you imagine any of the professional artists at an exhibition and they're exhibiting their work and they're striving to sell it and behave like a professional? Somebody comes along and says, you know, how much they love the work. They're not going to gush and say, do you really think it's okay? They're going to say, thank you, I like it too. You know, thank you, you know, I appreciate you loving my work, something like that. So learn how to take a compliment. Learn how to give yourself a compliment. If you're constantly saying negatives about yourself, about your work, you are not going to be able to work well. You are not going to be able to produce professional standard work under that degree of self-talk and stress. There's a part of your mind that doesn't know the difference between what's real and the self-talk that you give it. I've demonstrated that to my students by getting them to do an exercise where they sit in a chair and I get them to visualize walking towards the edge of a cliff. And then I get them to imagine that they are leaning forward over the edge of that cliff and looking down 1,000 foot. Because I'll talk them through this for a lot longer than I'm expressing here. And there would not be one of them, or myself even, who, on imagining they're looking down while leaning forward over the edge of a cliff, they start to experience physical sensations of wanting to withdraw, to pull back. Some of them have even experienced nausea. Some have experienced vertigo, that we have all wanted to pull back. We have not found it a comfortable experience, which is a way of proving to yourself that part of your mind is going to believe that self-talk. So if you start saying negative things about yourself, negative things about your painting ability, you're going to believe them. Now, I'm wanting to change something here, and I've got to work out what it is. Something in the Okay, I know what I need to do. Soften that out. There's a thing you can remove with watercolour. You can remove. If you're working with good quality paper, that's one of the things I always stress, is work with extremely high quality paper. Wanted a little bit more neck there. That's better. Better. Now, where do we need more dark? We're actually getting a good likeness to colour now. We're looking to refine this. A little dark in here. What I'm doing at the moment is coming in and putting some darker washes around, which will make the dogs in particular stand out more, and also colour stand out more. I can see that this is blue, and when I put the orange flake in, I'll be able to see that it's a lovely warm coral orange colour. So that I wet the paper so that I've got soft edges after I put this blue down, and you can see by darkening in here around the hairline, around Carla's arm, around the edges of the dogs, all of this wonderful main point of focus is going to stand out even more, and we're also developing more the fact that Carla is sitting in a rose garden. I'm turning this upside down to paint the shadows at the base. I'm working with opaque watercolour here, a little bit of gouache. I've got a tiny bit of the orange lake into this white, so I've warmed it slightly, and having put that wash in of the blue, now I have the iPad with the image of colour, but remembering I'm working in watercolours, I'm not trying to copy the photograph. So my shadows are not as dark in the background because I didn't want my roses to stand out as dominantly as that. So I can't put the shadows on the portrait as strong either. Everything has to be in proportion. If you change one part of your painting, you need to apply that throughout the whole painting. I've also got more greens in the photograph on the iPad, and I haven't put those greens into my painting. So you've got to remember, if you do refer to your reference photo, you're not copying a photo, you're following your initial plan. But what I am looking for is the pattern of light and shade that makes up the characteristics of the face. So we are following that. I'm working with my pure sable brushes, and I'm working with the cadmium orange and basically the cobalt blue. And they're really the only colours that I'm working with in this particular building up to get the final facial characteristics. And it's just a case of moving from the blue, where I want the cooler tone in the shadow, and into the orange, where I want it to be a little bit warmer. The cadmium orange is actually a very red orange, so it works beautifully for the flesh tones. There isn't a colour of flesh, it's light and shade, and it's whatever colours you're working with. And again, this is just not something that you can rush, and there's not a set rule. You can shadow a portrait face in one go, not just simply do a very simple shadow on one part of the face and leave another part of the face in light. It'll just be a very impressionistic face. They're not trying to get a likeness of a particular person. If you're striving for the likeness of a particular person, you have to work a little bit harder. Also, as I said, you're not trying to copy the photograph in this situation. If I was trying to copy the photograph, I probably would have done this in pastel pencils or even an oil paint or something that you could push around and have complete manipulation control over. Watercolor has to be the master. So a lot of what happens in a portrait is done by the water, and you have to just try to push it into what you're hoping for, but you don't have complete control. You've got to remember that with watercolor. You're not going to get the exact thing you're aiming for. If you do, you don't have a watercolor and the work is far too stiff. So just, you know, be a little forgiving of yourself as you work in watercolor. Otherwise, you're going to end up with something horribly stiff and unnatural. Anyhow, all I really have to do with this work in this final stage now is get really a mass of shadow over the eyes, a shadow over those cheeks, extend out the line of the lip shadow, think of it as shadows, And once those shadows are in, I'm ready to sign it. So we're almost there. And send off the image to Carla. And, well, she loves her dogs, darkening it around the eyes. I used to do my portraits from life. I'm not used to working like this from a photograph. I loved working from a setup. But I've enjoyed doing this. I hope you've enjoyed watching it build up slowly and realizing that it does take an artist at least 3 hours or more. This is going into just over the 3 hour mark with this one. And yes, you could continue working on and on and on, but there's no need. You stop when the painting is finished. You stop when you have a painting, when you have something that is pleasing. You don't have to keep on pushing on to try to get a copy of the photograph. We're not striving for that photorealism. We're striving for a painting. And all this needs now, as I said, is that extra bit of shadow over the eyes, down those cheeks, and we're going to have a fairly close likeness. And then it's a case of cropping it. I've got a nice crop image. I'm going across doing a landscape design crop on this rather than the vertical. I was actually read a very interesting blog today. It was by a gallery owner, and she was talking about what sells best in art, which might interest you. I too have been a gallery owner, and she was saying that the horizontal paintings sell far more easily than vertical painting. Having exhibited art all my life and sold art, I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I think when you're dealing with a vertical painting, you need a pair or three. They don't tend to sell as well by themselves. But if you do a nice little grouping of two or three, a vertical painting or what they call a portrait shape painting can sell very well. Pairs are very popular. So I guess it makes a pleasing arrangement, much like a horizontal would when hanging on the wall. I always anything of that vertical nature as a pair. So I hadn't really thought about that when I planned this as a vertical arrangement at the start. But yes, it would lend itself perhaps to have done the portrait of her daughter in the garden, or my husband in the garden, something like that. So to have a lovely little pair or a triptych even. I'm pleased with the likeness of the two dogs. That's worked out quite well. I like the draping of the dress. And if you remember from the photographs, the dress was a red floral and she was wearing a black cardigan. Now, I removed the black cardigan. I didn't feel that it added anything to the scene. It was fine on her that day, but far more pleasing, I think, to have left black out of this painting. What do you think? Would you have left the black cardigan on just because it was there in the photograph? Or would you have used your artistic liberty and said that you didn't feel that black enhanced the scene? Also, the dress was a red dress with a dark blue floral print. So tell me, how would you have treated this subject? Would you have created a full replica of the print on the dress, or would you have simplified the dress in the same way that I've done and put the focus on the dog's face and Carla's face hair? Would you have simplified the rose garden as I've done it? Here, I'm coming in with a little knife. It's an X-Acto knife or scalpel, and I'm scratching away where I've got a little bit of paint overlap onto the arm. We want a very clean edge there. So we're just scraping away a little bit of paper. You can do this because it's a high quality piece of 100% rag content paper, and so I'm not tearing the paper to do this, and it will give a lovely clean highlight. I like using the X-Acto blade where I want that clean, thin highlight. It's also great if you just want to pick out perhaps a hair here or there. Not something I'd use a lot, but it is great for cleaning back to the paper's edge. I often use this to enhance the leaf vein of a leaf-in highlight. That's the longer painting. But as I said, I'm going to crop this, the framing. No, I left this painting and had a break. And when I came back, it was amazing how much some of the shadows that I placed on the face had faded. The paper absorbs a lot of your paint. So I've needed to come back and start work on the shadows again. So again, I'm going in and darkening the area around the eyes, around the cheek. As I said, it was quite surprising how much the paper had absorbed the shadow. That's why you often need to leave a painting for a while, go for a little walk, take your eyes off it, come back and rework that area again. The general guide is if you're working with watercolour, your painting will dry paler than you put the work in. If you're working with acrylic paint, it will dry darker. If you're working with pastels or oil paint, it will stay much the same. However, if you were to spray a pastel with fixatives, any undercolour will start to bleed through and will affect that work. So, in other words, your darkest darks will become lighter if you have lighter pigment underneath it, or your darkest darks will become even darker if you've got something, say, black or intense underneath it, because the underneath will bleed through. That's worth knowing. So I don't use any fixatives when I'm working with pastel painting because it does affect the colouring. I'm signing my work with opaque watercolour or gouache. I picked out a colour that was in the dogs. I didn't want my name to stand out too strongly. It'll just merge into the painting much like one of the roses. So it's there, but not too dominant. And that's the crops that I chose for this work. As I said, it is not photorealism. I'm aiming for a little bit of impressionism. I'm trying to work more and more towards impressionism.